The fluorescent lights buzzed above me as I sat in that conference room, hands folded on the table, trying to keep my breathing steady. My chest was still tight from the panic attack I'd had 20 minutes earlier in the men's room. I hadn't told anyone. I just splashed cold water on my face, straightened my tie, and walked back in. My boss looked across the table at me like I was something she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. "We need to talk about what happened this morning," she said. Not quietly, not privately. In front of 11 other people. I opened my mouth. She raised one hand. "No. I'll do the talking. My name is Nathan Hargrove. I'm 31 years old, and for 3 years, I showed up to Pinnacle Creative Group every single day, gave everything I had, and made myself as small and invisible as possible. That morning, I'd had a panic attack during a client presentation. I hadn't collapsed. I hadn't made a scene. I'd excused myself, handled it, and come back. But my boss had already made her decision before I returned to the room. She stood up slowly, the way people do when they want the room to feel the weight of what they're about to say. "You embarrassed this agency in front of the Harlan account. You embarrassed me. And frankly, Nathan, this isn't the first time I've questioned whether you belong here. I felt every eye in that room on me. I want a closer, not a liability. And right now?" She tilted her head slightly. "You're a liability." She slid a manila envelope across the table. I looked down at it. Termination paperwork. Already printed. Already filled out with my name. She'd prepared it before the meeting. Before she even heard my side. "Your access card will be deactivated at 5 o'clock. HR will escort you out." She turned away like I was already gone. I picked up the envelope. I looked at it for a moment. Then I looked up at her. And I gave her the calmest smile I could manage. "Okay," I said. "Just that. One word." She blinked. She had expected tears, or an argument, or at minimum some visible devastation. I gave her none of it. I tucked the envelope under my arm, stood up quietly, and walked out of the conference room. What she didn't know, what nobody in that building knew, was that I had never once used my real last name at Pinnacle Creative Group. My full legal name is Nathan Elliott Hargrove Weston. My mother's maiden name is Hargrove. That's what was on my employee file, my business cards, and my email signature for 3 years. Weston is my father's name. My late father. The man who, 14 months before he died, restructured his entire estate through a holding company called Weston Capital Partners LLC and left me as the majority silent shareholder of every asset underneath it, including the parent company that owned Pinnacle Creative Group. I didn't plan any of what came next as some elaborate scheme. I want to be honest about that. For the first 2 weeks after she fired me, I just hurt. I sat in my apartment in downtown Charlotte and I felt the particular kind of shame that only comes from being humiliated in front of people you've worked beside for years. I replayed her voice in my head. A liability. I thought about my father, who had built something significant and quiet and real, and how little I had ever leaned on it, because he raised me to earn things myself. I questioned whether I'd been naive. I questioned a lot of things. There was one night, I won't pretend it didn't happen, where I sat on my kitchen floor at 2 in the morning with my back against the cabinet and genuinely didn't know what to do next. Not about the job. Not about her. Just about any of it. My father was gone. My apartment felt like a holding room. And the only person I'd trusted enough to tell about the panic attacks, a woman I'd been seeing for 8 months, had stopped returning my calls somewhere around week 2 of unemployment. I stayed on that floor for a while. Then I got up, made coffee, opened my laptop, and pulled up the documents my father's attorney had sent me 14 months ago that I had barely read. I read them now. All of them. Every page. By the time the sun came up, I understood exactly what I owned. Weston Capital Partners held a 67% controlling interest in a parent entity called Meridian Group Holdings. Meridian owned 4 operating companies. One of them, sitting right there in the portfolio like it had been waiting, was Apex Creative Solutions, which had acquired Pinnacle Creative Group in a quiet deal 3 years ago. The same 3 years I had been working there. I had taken the job before the acquisition closed. I had used my mother's name because I was 28, newly grieving, and the last thing I wanted was anyone treating me differently because of money I hadn't earned. I sat back in my chair and let that settle. I was the ultimate silent owner of the company that had just fired me. And the woman who called me a liability had no idea she worked for me. I called my father's attorney that morning. A man named Gerald Sutton, who had been managing the Weston estate for 11 years and who had the energy of someone who had seen everything twice. "Nathan," he said, "I've been wondering when you'd call. I need to understand my options," I told him. He was quiet for a moment. "Are we talking about Pinnacle?" I paused. "How did you know?" "I've been monitoring the portfolio. I saw the termination notice cross through payroll. Another pause. Your father would have moved faster. I'm not my father yet, I said. Walk me through it. Gerald walked me through it. Slowly, carefully. What I could do, what I couldn't, what was legal, what was clean. Meridian Group Holdings had a board of 5 members. 3 of them were my father's appointees, now effectively my appointees. I could call a board review of any subsidiary's executive leadership at any time. I could trigger an operational audit. I could initiate a restructure. None of it was dramatic. None of it was loud. That was the point. I didn't call my boss. I didn't send a message. I didn't post anything online. I just went quiet. And when you're someone people have already mentally filed undergone, going quiet is the most invisible thing in the world. The first thing I did was request a full financial audit of Pinnacle Creative Group through Meridian's compliance team. Standard procedure. Gerald called it, for any subsidiary underperforming against quarterly projections. Pinnacle had missed its targets 2 quarters in a row. The audit request was entirely routine, entirely justified, and entirely devastating for someone trying to hide mismanaged client billing. The audit team arrived on a Wednesday. I know because one of my former colleagues, a quiet guy named Marcus who sat 3 desks down from me and never said much but noticed everything, sent me a text. There are auditors here. Like, a lot of them. You know something? I replied, just heard some things. Sit tight. The auditors found what auditors find when they look carefully enough. Inflated contractor invoices. Client retainer fees logged twice. A consulting arrangement that existed mostly on paper. Connected to a vendor with the same billing address as my boss's personal LLC. It wasn't small. It wasn't ambiguous. It was the kind of thing that, once found, cannot be unfound. I want to be clear, I didn't plant any of it. I didn't fabricate a single document. Everything the auditors uncovered was already there, already real, already wrong. I just made sure someone finally looked. My boss didn't know any of this was coming. The day the preliminary audit findings went to the Meridian board, she was apparently at a client lunch, posting on LinkedIn about leading through uncertainty and building resilient teams. I saw the post. I kept scrolling. The second thing I did was reach out to the Harlan account directly. They were the client in whose presence I'd had a panic attack. The presentation she'd called an embarrassment. I contacted their VP of marketing through a mutual connection and set up a call, not as a Pinnacle employee, but as a principal of Weston Capital Partners exploring a consulting arrangement. We talked for an hour. I walked him through a campaign strategy for their Q4 product launch, the same one I'd been developing at Pinnacle, which she had dismissed along with me. He was quiet for a long stretch when I finished. This is exactly what we needed, he said. Why weren't you the one running point on this account? I let the silence answer for him. By the end of the month, the Harlan account had formally requested to sever its relationship with Pinnacle Creative Group and transition to an independent consultancy. The transitional consultancy's silent backer was Weston Capital. The revenue Pinnacle lost in that single month accounted for 31% of their active client billing. I was sitting in Gerald's office when he showed me the numbers. You know this is going to force a leadership review, he said. I know. The board will want to know who's running Pinnacle into the ground. I know that too. He looked at me over his reading glasses. You could have just filed a wrongful termination claim, would have been simpler. Simpler isn't the same as complete, I said. He smiled for the first time all meeting. Your father used to say something like that. I looked out the window for a moment. I know. He said it to me? What happened next? I heard about in pieces. Marcus kept texting. My boss had started coming in late, looking shaken. She'd fired 2 junior employees, apparently trying to find someone to blame for the audit findings. She'd brought in a PR consultant, which she billed to the company, which the auditors then flagged as another improper charge. Every move she made to cover herself created a new thread to pull. She tried calling me once. I saw her name on my screen and let it ring. She left a voicemail. Her voice was professional, controlled, but underneath it was something else. Something thin and uncertain. Nathan, this is Diana. I'm not entirely sure why you've been in contact with some of our clients, but if there's been a miscommunication about your departure, I'd like to clear that up. Give me a call. Miscommunication. That word? I forwarded the voicemail to Gerald with one line, for the record. He replied, noted and filed. The leadership review was called on a Thursday morning. I attended by video call, not as a former employee, not as a consultant, but under my full legal name for the first time in 3 years. My camera was off during the preliminary portion. The board chair, a man named Clarence who had known my father for 20 years, ran through the audit findings. The financial irregularities. The client attrition. The vendor irregularities connected to an LLC registered to the current managing director. Then he said, "We've asked the majority stakeholder of Weston Capital Partners to address the board before we proceed to a vote." He nodded at me. I turned my camera on. The silence on that call had a particular quality. I've thought about it since. It wasn't just surprise. It was the specific, irreversible silence of someone watching something they thought was solid reveal itself as hollow. My boss was on that call. Required attendance. I watched her face on the small grid of thumbnails on my screen. I watched her look at my face. I watched her look at my name. My full name? On the screen above my video feed. Nathan Elliott Hargrove Weston. She had fired me with my mother's name. She had called me a liability with my mother's name. She had never once asked anything else about me, not where I came from, not what else I'd built, not why someone with my capabilities was content to sit quietly at a mid-level account manager desk for 3 years. People rarely ask. They see the chair, and they decide. I spoke for about 8 minutes. Calmly. Without flourish. I outlined the findings, expressed the board's concerns, and stated clearly that a leadership transition was necessary to stabilize the subsidiary's operations and client relationships. I did not raise my voice. I did not mention the conference room. I did not mention the manila envelope or the word liability or the way she had turned away before I'd even stood up. I didn't need to. The documents did all of that. When I finished, Clarence opened it to questions. My boss unmuted herself. Her voice was steady, but only just. "I wasn't aware of your involvement with Weston Capital," she said. "I know," I replied. "You didn't ask." She unmuted again. Opened her mouth. Closed it. The board moved to a vote. The vote was not close. I didn't celebrate. That's the honest truth. Marcus called me that evening and said the office was completely unhinged, in the best possible way, and I listened, and I appreciated it, but I didn't feel the thing I thought I would feel. What I felt was quieter than that. More like a long exhale after holding your breath in a room full of smoke. I thought about my father that night. He had built Weston Capital over 30 years, slowly, methodically, brick by brick, and he had never once talked about it at dinner parties or led with it in introductions. He was just Dad. He was the man who taught me to parallel park and argued with me about baseball and fell asleep in his recliner watching old westerns. The money was real, but it was never the point. The point was what you built, and whether it was solid, and whether you could stand behind it. I had spent 3 years at Pinnacle trying to prove something to myself on even ground. Maybe that was naive. Maybe it was something else. But I didn't regret it, because I knew the way you know things in your chest rather than your head that I had earned every account I'd worked on. Every campaign. Every late night. I had done the work. And she had still looked at me in that conference room and seen something disposable. That part still sat in me. I won't pretend otherwise. But what I'd come to understand, sitting on that kitchen floor at 2 in the morning and then rising slowly into the weeks that followed, was that other people's inability to see you clearly is not a verdict on your value. It's only a verdict on their vision. My boss called again, 6 days after the board meeting. This time I picked up. She didn't open with anger. That surprised me, honestly. I'd expected anger, because anger is easier than the alternative. What I heard instead was something quieter and more uncomfortable. "I owe you an apology," she said. I waited. "The way I handled your termination was..." She paused. "It wasn't right. I was under pressure from the quarter numbers and I made you the answer to a problem you didn't create." I listened. I didn't interrupt. "I'd like to know if there's any path forward professionally, or..." She let that trail off. I thought for a moment about what my father would have said. He was not a sentimental man, but he was a fair one. He believed that how you treat people when you have the power says more about you than anything else ever will. "I appreciate you saying that," I told her. "And I mean that genuinely. But the position has been filled, and the direction of the organization is going to be different going forward." I kept my voice even. "I hope you find the right fit somewhere else." There was a long pause. "You were always more than I gave you credit for," she said finally. "I know," I said. Not unkindly, just honestly. "That's the part you should think about." I hung up. The weeks after that moved fast. Pinnacle was rebranded under Direct Meridian Management. Marcus got promoted to Senior Account Lead, which I had quietly recommended to Clarence, because Marcus had spent 3 years being exactly as capable as anyone who bothered to look would have noticed. I signed the documents for the Harlan account consulting engagement. I started working with Gerald on a broader strategy for the Weston Capital portfolio, things my father had put in place that needed a living hand to grow them forward. My panic attacks didn't vanish. I want to say that too, because the story would be cleaner if they had. But this isn't that kind of story. I found a doctor I trusted. I started talking about some things I had been carrying alone for longer than was reasonable. The night on the kitchen floor had made it clear that there was a version of strength that looked like handling everything alone, and a version that actually was strength, and they were not the same thing. My father had understood that. I was still learning it. One afternoon, about 2 months after the board meeting, I drove past the Pinnacle building downtown. The sign had already been updated. A new name. A new logo. A new managing director whose name I recognized as someone Clarence had been mentioning for years. Quiet, solid, fair. I drove past without stopping. I thought about the fluorescent lights in the conference room and the manila envelope. I thought about the word liability. And I thought about what it means to sit in front of someone who has already decided what you are before you ever opened your mouth. How lonely that is, and how much you can either let it define you or use it to clarify what you're actually building toward. I chose the second thing. 6 months later, I spoke at a small leadership conference in Raleigh. Not a big room. Maybe 200 people. I didn't talk about Pinnacle by name, and I didn't tell the story the way I've told it here. I talked about my father, and about the years I spent trying to earn something on my own terms, and about what it feels like to be reduced to a single bad moment by someone who never made the effort to understand the full picture. Afterward, a young woman came up to me. She looked like she was maybe 25, and she looked like someone who was carrying something heavy. "I got let go from my job last month," she said. "They told me I wasn't the right fit. I've been trying to figure out if they were right." I looked at her for a moment. "Can I ask you something? When they said that, did you believe them?" She thought about it. "Part of me did. That's the part to watch," I said. "Not because it's right, but because it'll try to win." She nodded slowly. I thought about the kitchen floor. "The people who can't see what you're actually worth are not authorities on the subject," I told her. "They're just people with limited vision making decisions with incomplete information. The question is what you build after they walk away." She stood there for a moment, and I could see her thinking about it, really thinking, the way you do when something lands somewhere real inside you. I shook her hand and walked out into the late afternoon sun. "My name is Nathan Elliott Hargrove Weston. I am the majority shareholder of Weston Capital Partners. I own, directly or indirectly, portions of 14 operating companies, a commercial real estate portfolio in 3 states, and the parent entity of the firm that once slid a termination envelope across a conference table and told me to be gone by 5 o'clock. But none of that is actually the point. The point is what my father spent 30 years trying to show me, not through speeches but through the patient, unhurried way he moved through the world. The point is that the people who see you only at your lowest moment and decide that is the full measure of you have made a very common and very costly mistake. You don't correct it with noise. You don't correct it with anger, or public scenes, or a single dramatic moment where you watch them realize they were wrong. You correct it by building something so undeniably real that eventually the facts speak for themselves. And then you move on. Not because they deserve your forgiveness. Not because what they did was right. But because you were never the story they told about you, and the sooner you stop waiting for their correction, the sooner you can start writing your own. Some people need you to announce yourself to see you. And some things you only understand once the silence after the announcement settles in. I'm still learning the difference. But I've got time. And now, for the first time in a long time, I've got the room.